All right, Aaron Rodgers, Dave Chappelle, and my new microphone demand that I get back into action. Aaron Rodgers. Let's take a look at what he said and how and why this demands, is just asking for us to be better critical thinkers and really examine what people are saying. So there's a handful of claims we want to go over with regard to Aaron Rodgers. First, I want to talk about his reaction and his preemptive strike about announcing his immunization and COVID-19 having this. So he came out and on the Pat McAfee's show talked about how he didn't expect to be the victim of woke culture and the woke culture mob and they have him in his crosshairs and before they put their cancel culture final nail in his coffin. All of that stuff. I want to go back to something too that he says. He refers to himself as a critical thinker. So if he's a critical thinker and his goal is genuinely the truth, then, and being honest and forthright and giving the best justification he can, he just did a really terrible job of it. Because all of those claims are kind of like a preemptive ad hominem sort of straw man, right? Like using those catchphrases and pandering to those people who are going to hear him and hear woke culture or cancel culture or woke mob. He's just trying to get people inflamed and fired up because there's no, at that point, like none of that has anything to do with what he's talking about. He's just trying to get people on his side. So he either is pandering to them and he is thinking critically, he's just being kind of disingenuous and trying to sway people's opinion by throwing out a bunch of like negative catchphrasey stuff. Or he is a horrible critical thinker and has no idea that those are all invalid arguments to make. You can't implicitly make those arguments. Calling people names or saying, my critics are really just the woke lynch mob or whatever the hell he said, that's not a legitimate argument because that doesn't address whether or not he was vaccinated, whether or not he was disingenuous with his team and the media, and whether or not one has a moral obligation or to get vaccinated. So all of that stuff, if you were tempted by it, if it resonated with you, that's okay, but realize you were doing something wholly irrational and buying into someone pandering to tap into your emotions. So the second thing is, what is the content of what he said? In explaining that when queried, he had mentioned that he was immunized. And that if in attempting to play it off as if he was just being forthright or something, that just is disingenuous. Maybe he's saying, hey, I was trying to be a little sneaky because I didn't want to deal with this publicly and didn't want people to be mad at me, so I lied. That would make sense to me. But saying when asked about vaccines, I was immunized, and pretending that you weren't trying to be a little bit evasive and misleading is a little weird. It's sort of like if I walked out of a pizza parlor and you asked, ooh, did you just eat some pizza? And I was like, well, I did eat something, and I was at the pizza parlor. Well, yeah, but did you eat a pizza? Well, I had an Italian delight that had crust. Yeah, did you eat a pizza? Hey, pepperoni and cheese. It was pizza-like substance. Did you eat a pizza, Chad? And I'd be like, calzone. Ha 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 ha. If you find out 3 months later I had a calzone, and I'm like, well, you didn't specifically. That would clearly be me being evasive. I don't get to like change the topic of the conversation and switch gears with a different word in an effort to deflect without just owning it. Just own it, Aaron Rodgers, and say, yeah, I was trying to be misleading. I was totally being misleading, and I wasn't following the spirit of the rules or regulations in the NFL or publicly because I don't agree with them. So that would have been a little more genuine, I believe. Now, the last thing to get to are his claims, and that's where it gets weird. And I feel okay doing it because he advertised that he believes himself not to be like, to paraphrase, an anti-vaxxer or flat earther. He's just a critical thinker. And again, if he's a critical thinker, he's a pretty terrible one. Because when answering the question, are you vaccinated? I'm immunized. In no way, shape, or form did he believe that people would rightly assume that he was undergoing a scientific or pseudoscientific process of developing one's immunity toward a very specific virus with the guidance of himself, I guess, and a handful of researchers who we don't know who they are, that he's privately come up with on his own. That's a whole part of what he was saying, was he wanted to do this on his own and secretly and privately, and he's not offering any details of it. So necessarily, he was trying to be misleading, because no one could have assumed that's what his immunization process was, because nobody knew it. No one could have conceivably known what it was. And so if he would have wanted to say, ooh, this is private stuff, and I'm not going to talk about it, but I'm not vaccinated, I'm following all the protocols for someone who's not vaccinated or whatever else, that's a different story. At least tell the truth. But he clearly didn't. And I can understand, like, you don't want to lose your sponsors, you don't want people to dislike you, you don't already cause enough kind of chaos you feel with your team because of your off-season stuff and not wanting to get into it. Cool, but just own it and admit it. And that would be the responsible thing to do. And he didn't do that. Now on to the scientific claims. It's very interesting to me that he simultaneously will say, oh, well, I didn't get vaccinated because I'm allergic to something in the vaccines, which there's only a couple of things it's possible to be allergic to, and that's like a 1 in a million chance. But he didn't specifically tell us what he's allergic to. 2 is he said there hasn't been any scientific research regarding how this might affect fertility. That's just like a really odd, arbitrary, random thing to be worried about when there's no evidence or reason to believe that it would affect one's fertility, right? Like, there's never been any comprehensive long-term studies regarding ketchup consumption and fertility. Therefore, I'm not going to eat ketchup. You would think I was crazy. Or, there hasn't been any long-term research about going to the dentist and a strong correlation between sterility. So I'm not going to go to the dentist. There's no reason to believe that the vaccine would cause sterility. So just throwing that out there seems like a really kind of odd thing. There's been no research studying fill in the blank. I could just come up with a gazillion things. The consequences of eating ice cream on Tuesdays with blindness. Well, that doesn't mean it's rational or justifiable for me to say, I'm not going to eat ice cream on Tuesdays because I don't want to go blind. It just seems like I'm making up a weird excuse. Now, the other part of it is there really is no scientific justification for the belief that getting a Johnson & Johnson vaccine is riskier than not getting one at all. There was only a handful of cases. It was 1 in like a gazillion. I think it really was approximately 1 in a million, but someone can double check that, of blood clotting disorders, and it only seemed to happen primarily, I believe, someone can check it out, in like women under the age of 50. And so there isn't probably a great explanation for why that happened, but it's certainly not riskier unless Aaron Rodgers has done a bunch of research, because clearly he said he's only committing to scientific stuff if there's been long-term research on it, which, by the way, his immunization procedure that he's talking about, there has been no long-term research on it. There couldn't have been. So it seems like he's picking criteria out of the air to justify his own opinion or belief. So there can't be research on that stuff. But we know that people are dying from COVID, and they aren't necessarily dying from Johnson & Johnson vaccine at a very high rate. Which brings us to the last thing, which is really important, and it's something that's going to come up again, because I got to do yet another video about this, I think, is people talking about this as if it's all about my own bodily autonomy. And what's very interesting to me about this is no part of the argument that one has an obligation to get vaccinated has to do with protecting themselves. That's like a spectacularly kind of self-interested, egoist justification. And we can show that egoist arguments fail almost all the time for moral justification. And by almost, I mean all the time. They're inherently contradictory. They just never work. An egoist argument saying this is right because it's right for me leads to all sorts of horrible things. I could just start murdering people because I like to do it. The obligation is to other people. The obligation isn't Aaron Rodgers, we're forcing you to protect yourself and you can get all freaked out about freedom and bodily integrity. The obligation is you have teammates who have kids who can't be vaccinated. We know that breakthrough cases are going to happen at a much lower rate than amongst people who are vaccinated than those who aren't. But it's still a possibility. If we all collectively take a vaccine, it becomes far less likely for anybody to get it, including those people who genuinely can't get vaccinated, who have genuine medical reasons or have been prohibited from being vaccinated up until this point. So it's not about the individual necessarily. It's about the fact that we live in a community among other people. And if we even pretend to say we care about our state or community or country or the United States, right? Like it's profoundly dismissive of your fellow people, human beings, countrymen, citizens, to say that they don't matter by saying my ability to make a apparently poorly justified decision that has no scientific backing behind it is more important than the well-being of your kid. And that's pretty much the crux of it. The moral obligation, Aaron Rodgers, is not to yourself, it's to the people around you. Because yes, you're a pretty fit, super rich dude who can handle all of the financial, economic, and practical consequences of getting this disease and overcoming it. Chances are nothing bad's going to happen to you. But what if you give it to your teammate, who gives it to their daughter, who gives it to a kid in their class, who gives it to someone who doesn't have those resources, and they end up dying? You are a part of that community that will have killed someone. I'm not saying it's directly your fault, but that's the whole reason to get vaccinated. It's not about you. That's the argument, at least. There might be good arguments against that, but Aaron Rodgers sure as hell didn't give one. Joe Rogan sure as hell didn't give one. No one's given one yet as to how and why it's morally justifiable to shirk the obligation we have, not just to ourselves, but to others. So, Aaron Rodgers, like C- in critical thinking, if that's what you're fancying yourself. But it's cool, you're not in a class of mine. Thanks for the time. A little long. We'll get back in the swing of things. Bye.